George Armstrong Custer's mistake caused a long-lasting controversy, with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer at its center, a man whose name became synonymous with reckless ambition and catastrophic failure. The debate over who was to blame often focuses on Custer and his senior officers, Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, each carrying the weight of history's harsh judgment. But to truly understand the tragedy of those June days in 1876, we must look beyond assigning blame and instead examine the broader context of a military campaign shaped by flawed strategy, missed opportunities, and deadly miscalculations. The roots of this tragedy can be traced to June 22, 1876, when Custer received orders from Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry. That day marked the beginning of the end for Custer and his men, as they set out on a perilous mission into Montana Territory's Rosebud Valley. For the first time in its 10-year history, the 7th Cavalry operated as a unified regiment. An indication of just how significant this mission was. The objective was clear: find and engage the Sioux and Cheyenne forces gathering near the Little Bighorn River. However, the orders Custer received were anything but straightforward. General Terry's directive gave Custer a degree of freedom in how to carry out his mission, freedom that would ultimately lead to disaster. Custer was instructed to follow the trail found by Major Reno and prevent the tribes from escaping south or southeast. But the vague wording of Terry's orders left room for interpretation, and Custer's critics argue that this ambiguity gave him license to act on personal whim. However, this view misunderstands military protocol. When Terry said he could not give any definite instructions, it wasn't an open invitation for Custer to ignore the overall plan. Custer's disregard for these orders wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a grave breach of military discipline. Custer's defiance of Terry's intent became clear as the 7th Cavalry moved deeper into Rosebud Valley. Terry had laid out a precise plan. Custer was to scout the upper reaches of Tolk Creek to ensure no enemy forces were lying in ambush. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a critical step in the campaign. Yet, driven by his hunger for glory and a swift victory, Custer bypassed this essential reconnaissance and led his regiment straight toward the Little Bighorn River. By doing so, he not only exposed his left flank but also sacrificed the chance to coordinate with Colonel John Gibbon's infantry, losing the strategic advantage in the process. This reckless decision triggered a chain of events that would lead to disaster. As the regiment advanced, signs of a large hostile force grew impossible to ignore. The trail they were following was wide and heavily trampled, indicating a much larger enemy presence than expected. But Custer, blinded by his ambition, saw these clues not as warnings but as confirmation that victory was within reach. He dismissed the concerns of his officers and scouts, maintaining an air of arrogant confidence that hid the danger looming ahead. Custer's missteps become even more glaring in the context of the larger 1876 military campaign. The U.S. Army's strategy hinged on three separate columns, under General Crook, Colonel Gibbon, and General Terry, converging to confront the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes. Each faced its own difficulties, but it was Custer's rash actions that ultimately derailed the campaign. First, General Crook's forces had been repelled at the Battle of the Rosebud, forcing them to retreat. Meanwhile, Gibbon's columns struggled with rugged terrain and logistical delays as they marched north. Timing and coordination between the three columns were essential for success, but Custer's decision to rush into the Little Bighorn Valley prematurely isolated his regiment and left them vulnerable. By June 22, the 7th Cavalry had camped near the mouth of the Rosebud, a meandering stream surrounded by steep cliffs and sagebrush-covered hills. The tension was palpable, with soldiers knowing they were on the brink of a battle that could either elevate their careers or claim their lives. That evening, Custer convened a meeting with his officers, a rare act for a commander known for his autocratic style. He laid out his expectations: cautioning his lieutenants not to stray too far or let eagerness drive them ahead. But even as he spoke these words of caution, his mind was racing ahead, already devising bold moves he believed would lead to glory. What he could not know was that he was marching headlong into a deadly trap. The officers listened attentively, though not all were convinced by their commander's strategy. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, leader of Company K, would later recall that during the meeting, Custer seemed unusually subdued. His typical air of arrogance had faded, replaced by a quieter, more contemplative demeanor, suggesting the weight of responsibility was pressing heavily upon him. Custer estimated they might face around 1,500 warriors, a number that, while daunting, was still far below the grim reality they were soon to encounter. On June 23, the regiment continued its march, moving cautiously through abandoned camps that dotted the Rosebud Valley. Evidence of a large, organized force was everywhere. Wagon tracks etched into the earth, and the grass trampled by the hooves of thousands of horses. As they passed one deserted camp, Custer turned to his chief scout, Lieutenant Charles Varnum, and remarked with frustration, "This is where Reno made the biggest mistake of his life. He had 6 companies and enough rations for days. He could have made a name for himself if he'd kept after them." Custer's words betrayed his obsession with personal glory and his disdain for caution, a theme that would become central to the unfolding disaster. By mid-afternoon, the column reached Greenleaf Creek and paused to rest. The soldiers, exhausted after days of hard riding, gratefully dismounted to stretch their aching limbs. But Custer remained on edge, scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. He knew they were close, the tracks were fresher, the ashes of campfires still warm, yet the village remained hidden, just beyond the rolling hills and dense brush that obscured the valley ahead. The following day, June 24, dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for marching. Custer's scouts, including Mitch Boyer and the brave Bloody Knife, returned with reports of fresh tracks heading up the valley. Determined to maintain the element of surprise, Custer ordered an early departure. The column moved swiftly but cautiously, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft ground and tall grass. By midday, they reached a narrow point in the valley, flanked by rugged cliffs and dense pine forests. Here, Custer made a critical decision. He paused to send scouts ahead to reconnoiter Tulloch Creek, hoping to ensure no enemy forces lay in wait. This moment presented a chance to rectify his earlier mistakes and gather crucial intelligence. But impatience got the better of him. When the scouts reported a large trail heading west, Custer decided to push forward without further delay. It was a fateful decision, driven by a dangerous mix of arrogance and desperation. Arrogance in believing his regiment could handle whatever lay ahead, and desperation to strike before the natives scattered. As they pressed on, passing larger and fresher camps, the signs of a massive gathering were undeniable. The scouts grew visibly anxious, urging caution, but Custer disregarded their concerns. Convinced the village was fleeing, he believed only an aggressive advance would prevent their escape. Ironically, the village wasn't retreating. It was growing, as more warriors joined the camp. By late afternoon, the regiment reached East Muddy Creek, where the trail widened to over a mile. The ground was marked with the passage of thousands of horses, and abandoned items littered the landscape. Yet even this overwhelming evidence did not deter Custer. He ordered a brief halt to rest the men and feed the horses, then resumed the march, intent on catching the village before nightfall. The final hours of the day were filled with mounting tension. The soldiers, weary and anxious, rode in silence, their eyes scanning the narrowing valley for any sign of movement. The dark cliffs loomed closer, enclosing them as the scent of pine and wildflowers filled the air. An oddly peaceful backdrop to the impending storm. Custer knew the village was near. He could almost hear faint sounds carried on the wind, but still, it remained hidden, just beyond the next rise. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, Custer ordered the regiment to make camp near a bend in Rosebud Creek. Fires were lit, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the evening air. But conversation was sparse. The soldiers knew they were on the cusp of something monumental, and the weight of that knowledge hung over the camp like a shroud. Custer himself was no less introspective. He paced along the camp's edge, occasionally stopping to consult with his officers or exchange brief words with his scouts. His face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was tight with focus. He was a man standing on the precipice between triumph and disaster, fully aware of what lay ahead. But despite the gnawing doubts that crept into his mind, Custer remained resolute. At dawn, he would attack, catch the village by surprise, and deliver the decisive blow that would end the campaign in a blaze of glory. But it was a plan built on arrogance and ambition, and it would end in disaster. While Custer and his men rested, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were already preparing for battle. They had seen the rising dust of the soldiers approach and heard the distant thunder of hooves. Far from fleeing, they were gathering, ready to defend their families and their way of life with a fierce determination that would shock the world. The stage was set for a legendary confrontation, a story of bravery and hubris, heroism and tragedy, as the stars wheeled overhead and the prairie wind whispered through the dark valley. Custer's fate was sealed. Dawn would not bring the victory he craved, but a reckoning that would echo through history, a cautionary tale of the perils of unchecked ambition and the unforgiving realities of war.